The Prime Minister insists the latest round of airstrikes against Houthi targets in Yemen were in response to an ongoing and imminent threat. The UK and US carried out their second joint operation on the rebels last night. It hit 8 targets, including an underground storage site. The Houthis have described the action as a strategic mistake and vowed to retaliate. The conflict erupted after the Iran-backed military group started targeting ships which they believe are linked to Israel and the West in the Red Sea in response to the ongoing conflict in Gaza. Delivering an update to the House of Commons this afternoon, Rishi Sunak insisted the UK is not seeking confrontation, but will not hesitate to act again if necessary.
At my order overnight, the RAF engaged in a second wave of strikes against Houthi military targets in Yemen. We did so because we continue to see, including in intelligence, an ongoing and imminent threat from the Houthis to UK commercial and military vessels and to those of our partners in the Red Sea and wider region. I told the House last week that we would not hesitate to respond if the acts continue in order to protect innocent lives and preserve the freedom of navigation. And that is what we have done. We acted alongside the United States with support from Australia, Bahrain, Canada and the Netherlands. We acted on the same basis as the 11th of January, fully in line with international law, in self-defence and in response to a persistent threat. And as with the first wave, the strikes were limited to carefully selected targets with maximum care taken to protect civilian lives.
And joining me in the studio now, TalkTV's political correspondent, Alicia Fitzgerald. Thanks, Alicia. Columnist at The Times, award-nominated columnist Hugo Rifkin. Good to see you, Hugo. Down the line, we're joined by former NATO commander, Rear Admiral Dr Chris Parry. Chris, good to have you back on the programme. On Friday, we were discussing an imminent threat of war. Of course, the word imminent really is, depends on your perspective on all of this. But I think you mentioned that this conflict with the Houthi rebels could result in war if we didn't take it with a certain degree of seriousness and indeed, I would say, wariness. I think that's what you might have been trying to convey. So maybe you'll go back over what you said on Friday and examine it in the light of what we discover has happened since.
Well, Vanessa, thanks for recalling that conversation. We said at the time, of course, that this is a major threat to international trade in a strategic waterway. We call it a choke point at sea. We also reflected that the sea is the physical equivalent to the World Wide Web. So this is very disruptive indeed. And I think we're already starting to see prices in our petrol pumps increasing and inflation more generally in our supermarkets starting to increase as a result as well. So we're starting to feel that. There's a very tenuous link between what the Houthis are doing and the conflict in Gaza. In some ways, it's an excuse. They're trying to increase their profile. They're advancing their credentials with Iran, of whom they are proxies. And that aspect of it is what is needing to be suppressed at the moment. And as you heard from the Prime Minister, we're taking calibrated action to deal with threats as they emerge in relation to shipping both military and civilian in the Red Sea.
When you say, Chris, they're trying to increase their profile, you make them sound a bit like a reality wannabe in a show on Love Island or something. Why do the Houthis want to increase their profile? Who with and what for?
Well, they are proxies for Iran, and Iran right now is trying to project across the greater Middle East for internal reasons because the regime itself is under threat. You've got a succession crisis anticipating the death of Ayatollah Khomeini, who's the supreme leader. You've got 70% of the population under 35 and very, very unruly in relation to the way they're being governed at the moment. And what we're seeing is also the prospect of Iran having a nuclear device in 2025. So all these things are creating internal tensions within Iran. They're projecting outwards. They've decided to take on Israel through their proxies at the moment. The Houthis see an advantage for themselves in Yemen. They can maneuver relative to the local factions with whom they interact every day of the year. Yemen isn't a stable country. Again, going back to demographics, the median age in Yemen is 17.2. Whereas in Europe, it's 42, for example. So it just shows you've got lots of young people, again, unemployed, no economic prospects. You can actually work for the Houthis for $100 a week. In fact, sorry, that's not true. It's $20 a week. You can work for Hamas for $100 a week, paid for by the Iranians.
Wow. And so when you were saying on Friday, I mean, you were saying it guardedly. You weren't saying this is about to erupt into a full-scale war right now. That's not at all what you were saying. But when you were sort of saying there are possibilities, this could broaden, it could be, you know, something that engulfs many more countries and it could eventually lead to war. These retaliations by the United Kingdom, the United States, are they wise? Are we doing the right thing? When Rishi Sunak says we're responding to their provocation, we'll continue to respond, we'll carry on doing this. Is that the right technique and the right strategy, or will it just irritate them? Is it poking the bear, as they say?
No, the only escalation, Vanessa, and I think you know this, is coming from them. And what we're saying is, look, we're keeping the lid on it. And let's see, if we hadn't done this, what you'd be seeing is cruise missiles and ballistic missiles flying in the direction of Israel and all sorts of other directions. They'd be taking out ships in the Red Sea. Right now, we're saying to the Houthis, we don't like what you're doing, and we've threatened you already. And if you threaten something, you've got to do it. I'm afraid one of the big weaknesses of democracies is they haven't in recent years been able to effectively threaten and use force. This is a good use of force. It stops the conflict actually widening. And it says to the Houthis, look, if you want to step up the action, we can do that. In fact, we can do it 1,000 times better than you. I remember when I was working with an American general, General Mattis, in Iraq, he said, look, there are two types of violence. There's instrumental violence, which we in the West understand, and there's performative violence, which I'm afraid the Arab world understands. And a lot of what the Houthis are doing is performative violence to show that they are the strong horse, as they say. And so we've got to deal with that in those terms. And when they say to us, look, we're performing violence here, we've got to say, you know what, we understand this and we can do this 1,000 times better than you can.
And can we? Do we have the money? Do we have the resources? Do we have the weaponry? Do we have the manpower? Because only the other day, you see, I was listening very carefully to every word you uttered on Friday on the programme, that you were talking about, you know, difficulty in recruiting people to the military, especially people of calibre. And do we have what it takes to keep on outperforming performative violence?
Vanessa, during the Cold War, we spent 5.2% of our GDP on defence because we thought it was so important. We spend less than 2.2% of our GDP at the moment. And do you know what? Things like this are the best recruiter, because young people say, look, this is definitely worthwhile. We're trying to make the world a more peaceful place. We're trying to contain the bad guys. That is a job I want to do. And if you look at some of the good wars we've been involved with in the past, like the Falklands, it's been a great recruiter because people suddenly see the reason why we have good armed forces, to keep the peace of the world, and I'm afraid to keep the bad guys away.
Let me bring in our political correspondent, Alicia Fitzgerald here. Rishi Sunak saying, OK, we've done it before, we're doing it again, we're going to carry on doing it. I'm not going to ask permission. I'm not going to sit here in Parliament talking about it. It's already been done. It happened last night, fait accompli. How's that going over politically? Is that really quite, I don't know, inspirational leadership? It's going over well. Is this going to be, as people always say in wartime, a good war for him, in that it is, I know, violence, performative violence?
Well, last night and this morning, there was some concern that Rishi Sunak hadn't run this past the Speaker of the House of Commons and the Leader of the Opposition. Lots of Labour MPs were coming forward this morning and really expressing some anger towards that and saying that it is kind of custom to bring in the opposition parties to this. Some information has emerged since then saying that actually Keir Starmer was alerted maybe just after the decision was taken, but he was aware last night. So that can kind of put that slightly to bed. That, however, doesn't silence the other MPs in Parliament who feel really strongly against this. The SNP, for example, that's the Scottish National Party, the Liberal Democrats, and then lots of Labour MPs towards the left of the Labour Party who are totally against this military action, lots of them standing up in the Commons today and expressing their anger towards this decision.
And as Hugo Rifkin of The Times, what are Times readers saying in response to this?
As far as I can make out, the view is generally this is something we have to do. This is part of our sort of global policing responsibilities. What I sort of like at the moment, you look at Rishi Sunak. Rishi Sunak doesn't look like a man who's particularly enjoying this. Doesn't look like he's hating it, but he's not having that sort of great uplift that you had that David Cameron had when he went to war in Libya.
Well, that jingoism.
Where he looked like he was loving it, and he looked like he was showing his own might and power. For Rishi Sunak, this is a hassle. He doesn't want to be doing
Are you
this.
too young to remember Mrs. Thatcher and the Falklands?
Because
it was a similar thing then. It was a kind of
I remember a bit,
puffed up
yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
Fred Carno's army kind of a thing. It was a whole big kind of... I don't know whether Chris Parry will agree or not, but she was kind of, I would say, kind of metamorphosized by war into a different kind of warlike, bellicose type of Boadicea type leader, and it served her very, very well. Let me see if Dr. Chris Parry, are you old enough to remember this, or am I the only person antediluvian enough to remember the Falklands War, for God's sake?
Vanessa, I fought in the Falklands War.
Well, there you are. Then what happened to Mrs. Thatcher as leader during the Falklands War? She kind of was transmogrified by it, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was, Vanessa, but there's another point. I've written a book on the Falklands. It was my diary at the time. It's called Down South. And I reflect in that, I went away to sea in March of 1982. And when I came back in July, the country had changed.
True.
There was a whole different spring in its step.
True.
It wasn't, yeah.
It's absolutely true. I was 20 and I remember it very, very clearly. The whole mood changed. Every schoolboy in the land acquired a map of the Falklands. People who'd never heard of it in their entire lives became experts on it instantly. The Malvinas, something we knew exactly what it was. It rhymed with something saucy, which made it very attractive to talk about. And up yours, Delors, and all of that kind of thing. It was a whole big deal, and it was absolutely hugely character changing and mood changing. Absolutely right. That's quite right. So what else did you put in your diary?
And great for recruitment too at the time.
And great for recruitment. So Hugo, you don't think that Rishi Sunak is that kind of a leader, but nevertheless,
I don't think this is something he wants to be doing. I think it is. I mean, the Houthis are not attacking British boats because we're involved in bombing them. They're attacking boats already. They are destabilizing that part of the world.
Yes,
they're blocking access to the Suez Canal. We are one of the largest militaries in the world. It makes sense that we're doing this along with the Americans. I don't think this is something that is going to have major political blowback on Rishi Sunak, or conversely, that he's using to garner major political support, which I actually think is the way, if we're going to do military intervention in the world, we ought to be doing it.
Do you agree, Alicia?
Yes, I think the general consensus overall is that he's made the right decision. And also, I think generally lots of people agree that given the context and the circumstances, having time to consult Parliament maybe before taking this decision would have been maybe a delay that we couldn't really afford. At the same time, that doesn't mean there is no backlash to it whatsoever, not just politically, but in the public as well.
And Dr. Chris Parry, when you were looking at the kind of rollout of the war between Israel and Gaza, and today the next item on this programme is going to be Israel's deadliest day. Israel's lost 25 army, soldiers in just one day yesterday. It was absolutely tragic for Israel yesterday. Obviously, the total death toll in Gaza is something like 25,000 people. The whole thing is really hellish to watch and ghastly in every way for every side. But when you watch it, can you see any way in which this conflict will be concluded? And do you have any idea of any sort of time frame?
Vanessa, Israel has no choice. It was attacked on the 7th of October. It has to eradicate the threat from Gaza. Otherwise, it will live with an existential threat well into the future. The way it ends, there are two ways it ends. Hamas comes to terms and releases the hostages, because I've always said the easiest way to end a war is to lose it. Or secondly, Israel pursues its strategic objectives and demilitarizes Gaza and puts in place a new regime that actually doesn't pose a threat. I would think that the first bit of it could happen now, tomorrow, if Hamas decides that actually it wants peace for the people of Gaza. I think if it's down to Israel, it's probably another month or so, and very hard slogging through urban territory.
Thank you very much. I'll say goodbye to you, Dr. Chris Parry, Admiral Dr. Chris Parry. Thank you for joining me on the show.